What if everything you thought you knew about the ancient Egyptians was wrong? Were they black Africans? Semitic people from the Middle East? Or something else entirely? How could a civilization so advanced, builders of the pyramids, architects of immortality, leave behind so many clues, yet still keep their true identity locked behind the sands of time? Today, we peel back the layers of myth, propaganda, and buried truth. The racial identity of the ancient Egyptians is a puzzle finally being solved. Before we begin, subscribe to Whispers of the Past and join us as we uncover the secrets they never taught you in school. Step into the Nile Valley 5,000 years ago, a land of scorching sun, towering temples, and gods who walked among men. Ancient Egypt rose from the fertile floodplains like a mirage unmatched in its majesty. But from the moment Western explorers first laid eyes on the ruins of Thebes and Giza in the 18th and 19th centuries, they were captivated and puzzled. The mummies they unearthed had features that defied neat racial categorization. The 19th century world, divided by empires and obsessed with racial hierarchies, could not fathom that a black African civilization might have built the greatest monuments of the ancient world. So Egypt was claimed by many, by Europeans, by Arabs, by Africans. The question wasn't just about history, it was about identity and power, the evidence they left behind. To unlock the truth about who the ancient Egyptians really were, we must let them speak for themselves, not through modern theories or colonial imaginations, but through what they left behind. Across the shifting sands of time, they carved their stories into temple walls, painted their identities on tombs, and buried secrets with their dead. The evidence is not silent. We've just refused to listen. Let's begin with what strikes us first: their art. The walls of tombs from Luxor to Saqqara come alive with color-vivid reds, ochres, blacks, golds. Pharaohs are depicted with reddish-brown skin, standing tall in triumph. Queens are often painted in lighter hues, perhaps as a symbolic gesture of gender, or as a stylized reflection of idealized beauty. But step into the tomb of Mekheder, or the painted scenes of Nefertari, and you'll notice something else. Skin tones vary. Hairstyles range from short afro-like curls to shoulder-length black wigs. Wide noses, full lip straights associated with Sub-Saharan Africa appear again and again in royal statuary and temple reliefs. Were these just artistic conventions, or reflections of who they were? Now compare this to how foreigners were drawn. In Egyptian art, the line between us and them was clear. Libyans are shown with light skin and feathers in their hair. Asiatics, or Amu, wear long robes and have pointed beards. Nubians, or Naisi, are drawn with dark skin, tightly curled hair, and distinct jewelry. And yet, these depictions are not strictly racial, they are ethnographic. They represent cultural identity, not skin color alone. The Egyptians were telling us, this is who we are, and this is who we are not. But where exactly did they place themselves on this spectrum? To understand how the Egyptians saw themselves, we turn to their own words. They called their land Kemet, the Black Land. This, scholars say, was in contrast to Deshret, the Red Land, referring to the barren deserts that surrounded the fertile Nile Valley. Most Egyptologists agree Kemet referred primarily to the rich, dark silt left behind by the Nile floods. But is it just soil? Some Afrocentric scholars, like Cheikh Anta Diop, propose that the name Kemet might also reference the skin tone of its people, a poetic self-reference to their blackness. Critics argue this interpretation is speculative, yet it persists because the Egyptians themselves often described their own people using terms denoting darkness or blackness. They called themselves the Remech and Kemet, the people of the Black Land. Foreigners were classified as outsiders. Amu, Libu, Naisi. In Egyptian cosmology, to be Egyptian was to belong to a sacred order, the Mat, balance, harmony, and divine legitimacy. Foreigners, by contrast, represented chaos, disorder, or threat. Identity to the Egyptians was sacred and exclusive. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, as Western imperialism reached its peak, European scientists began to study Egyptian remains, not to understand them, but to classify them. Using skull measurements and facial angles, they tried to place ancient Egyptians into racial categories that fit their worldview. Many concluded that the Egyptians were Caucasoid, sometimes even arguing they were Hamitic, a now discredited racial category invented to explain how advanced African civilizations must have had non-African origins. Their conclusions were used to justify colonial ideologies. If Africans didn't build Egypt, then colonial rule was simply reclaiming what was never theirs to begin with. But even as early as the 1870s, inconsistencies began to emerge. Craniologist Dr. Samuel George Martin, a prominent American racial theorist, collected hundreds of Egyptian skulls and was surprised to find broad noses, prognathous jaws, and cranial shapes more consistent with Sub-Saharan African populations than with Europeans or Middle Easterners. Yet these results were downplayed or twisted, and thus the bias of the observer distorted the truth of the observed. The mummies of Egypt are perhaps the most intimate evidence we have preserved faces of kings and commoners alike, frozen in time. Some have tightly curled hair. Others have straighter strands. Some have full lips and broad noses. Others do not. But appearance, as we know, can be deceptive. Enter forensic reconstructions. When scientists reconstructed Tutankhamun's face using CT scans and forensic techniques, they found a young man with full lips, wide cheekbones, and a nose that could easily pass for Sub-Saharan African. Yet many Western media outlets focused on his health defects, ignoring the clear African features staring back from the digital model. Some mummies, like Yuya and Thuya, appear to have more Levantine features. But these individuals likely had foreign ancestry, part of Egypt's long tradition of intermarriage, diplomacy, and conquest. Then there's the ancient hair controversy. Preserved hair in tombs ranges from tightly coiled to wavy to straight. But environmental conditions, embalming chemicals, and post-mortem changes often alter texture. It's no clear racial indicator. In the end, the physical remains of the Egyptians tell a story of diversity, of a people who emerged from Africa, expanded into empire, and mingled with the world. Look beyond the bodies and into the structures. The step pyramids of Saqqara, the mortarless obelisks of Karnak, the colossal heads of Ramses. These monuments show architectural methods strikingly similar to those in Nubia, Meru, and even further south into the Sahel. The pre-dynastic civilization of Nagda Playa deep in southern Egypt, near the Sudanese border, predates the pyramids and shows clear African cultural patterns: cattle worship, astronomy, ceremonial burial mounds. The writing, too, evolved from African pictographs, gradually refined into the sacred script of hieroglyphs. The Nile didn't just nourish Egypt, it connected it to the entire African continent. To see Egypt as isolated from Africa is like calling the Amazon rainforest a part of Europe because it's lush. The genetic revolution. For centuries, speculation reigned. Theories clashed. Voices rose and were silenced. But then came the moment where bones began to speak in the language of molecules, and time itself bent to the power of science. In a lab tucked away from the sands of the Nile, the deepest mystery of Egypt's past was finally given a voice. This is the age of ancient DNA, and its revelations are as shocking as they are incomplete. For decades, scientists struggled to extract DNA from Egyptian mummies. The embalmers of old, in their quest to preserve the flesh, had inadvertently destroyed its genetic memory. Heat, salt, resin, time, these enemies conspired to silence the biological record. But technology advanced, and in 2017, the impossible became reality. A group of scientists from the Max Planck Institute for the Science of Human History and the University of Tübingen published a peer-reviewed study in Nature Communications. The title? Ancient Egyptian Mummy Genomes Suggest an Increase of Sub-Saharan African Ancestry in Post-Roman Periods. In this quiet, academic phrasing lay a thunderclap. Researchers had extracted nuclear DNA, not just the degraded mitochondrial snippets, from 90 mummies spanning 1,300 years, from the New Kingdom to the Roman era. All from a single archaeological site, Abusir el-Melek, located in Middle Egypt, roughly 70 miles south of Cairo. And what they found was controversial. The DNA revealed that these ancient Egyptians shared the most genetic affinity not with modern Egyptians, nor with sub-Saharan Africans, but with ancient populations from the Levant, the Caucasus, and Anatolia, what is today modern-day Syria, Lebanon, Israel, and Turkey. In essence, the mummies were more Middle Eastern in their genetic makeup than African, at least by modern geographical labels. What's more, their DNA showed very little sub-Saharan African ancestry, less than 10%. This shook the foundations of popular Afrocentric narratives and was immediately seized upon by some media outlets. Headlines proclaimed, "Ancient Egyptians were not black. DNA shatters Afrocentric myths." The pharaohs were Middle Eastern. But as with so much in history, context is everything. Here's what the headlines left out. All 90 mummies in the study came from a single site, Abusir el-Melek, which during the periods these individuals lived was heavily influenced, if not outright controlled, by foreign empires. From the late period onward, Egypt was no longer ruled by native dynasties. The Assyrians invaded, followed by the Persians, then Alexander the Great, then the Ptolemies, Greek kings who reigned as pharaohs, and finally the Romans, who absorbed Egypt into their empire. By the time these individuals were buried, the Egyptian gene pool had already been altered by centuries of conquest, migration, and assimilation. What the DNA really revealed was what Egypt had become, not what it originally was. In fact, the authors of the study themselves warned, the mummies used in this study come from a region of Egypt that had particularly strong ties to the Near East. They may not be representative of the entire population of ancient Egypt. The mummies in the study were from Lower Egypt, the northern part of the country, closer to the Mediterranean and the Levant. But the heart of early Egyptian civilization was in the south, Upper Egypt, and even further south in Nubia, in what is now Sudan. It was in Upper Egypt that the first dynasties rose. It was here that Narmer unified the two lands, and it was here, in the cradle of African kingdoms, that the early pharaohs emerged. But none of the sampled DNA came from this region, and that is key. The earliest Egyptians likely had far stronger sub-Saharan African ancestry, especially those in Thebes, Abydos, and Elephantine centers of religious and royal power. More recent studies of modern Egyptian DNA show a south-to-north gradient. Southern Egyptians carry significantly more African genetic markers. Or northern Egyptians carry more West Asian and European ancestry, especially after centuries of Arabization, invasions, and Ottoman influence. So, if the 2017 DNA study tells us anything, it's this: Egypt changed, but the original identity remains beneath the sand waiting to be sequenced. Since 2017, other studies have tried to expand the picture. In 2020, researchers analyzed the genomes of modern Egyptians and found that up to 70% of their ancestry derives from ancient African populations, with only modest contributions from Arab or Mediterranean sources. In Sudan, excavations of Kushite tombs and early Nubian remains revealed genetic links to ancient East and Central Africa. These kingdoms were not just neighbors of Egypt, they were sometimes its conquerors. Some scholars now argue that the dynastic Egyptians, especially before the New Kingdom, were part of a broader Nile Valley civilization complex stretching from Nubia through Upper Egypt and into the Sahara. These were African civilizations in origin and cultural orientation, long before foreign incursions. As ancient DNA extraction improves and more tombs are opened in Upper Egypt, we may soon hear directly from Narmer, Imhotep, or even Hatshepsut, not through stone, but through their double helix. And yet, all of this raises a deeper question. Are we asking the wrong thing? The concept of race as we know it, based on skin color, cranial measurements, and categories like black or white, did not exist in the ancient world. The Egyptians saw themselves as Egyptian, as members of Ma'at, the divine cosmic order. They defined themselves by religion, language, geography, and lineage, not by melanin. But modern politics, especially in the wake of colonialism, racial injustice, and cultural erasure, has made Egypt a battlefield of identity. For African scholars, reclaiming Egypt is about reclaiming dignity. For Arab nationalists, it is about continuity. For Western academia, it's about objectivity, though that too has often been a mask for bias. DNA can guide, but it cannot resolve what is ultimately a human struggle over ownership of the past. In truth, the genetic revolution didn't answer the question. It deepened it. DNA revealed that Egypt was a genetic melting pot with connections to Africa, the Near East, and eventually Europe. It showed that race is not static, and neither is identity. And most importantly, it proved what many already knew. Egypt was not isolated. It was a crossroads. But that crossroads stood at the northern edge of a mighty continent, Africa. And the civilization that emerged from it, though shaped by trade and war and diplomacy, was born of the Nile. It was African. And no test tube, no statistic, no distorted headline can take that away. Why this question matters so much? Why does this question matter so much? Because Egypt is more than a civilization. It's a mirror. To claim Egypt is to claim the power of legacy. If Egypt is African, then Africa gave birth to the earliest lights of science, medicine, architecture, and writing. If Egypt is Middle Eastern or Mediterranean, it validates another set of historical claims. But here's the truth. The ancient Egyptians were Africans, not in a simplistic racial sense, but geographically, culturally, and biologically. Their skin color likely ranged from deep brown in Upper Egypt to lighter tones in the north. Their identity was fluid, complex, and multi-layered. They traded with Nubia, fought the Hyksos, married Libyans, conquered the Levant, and were later ruled by Greeks and Romans. Egypt was a crossroads, not a race. To reduce them to a modern racial category is to misunderstand both them and ourselves. Puzzle solved. So, what race were the ancient Egyptians? They were Egyptians, a people born of the Nile, shaped by Africa, influenced by Asia, and admired by the world. Modern science confirms what ancient art, language, and tradition long suggested. Egypt was an African civilization that engaged with its neighbors. Its people cannot be neatly boxed into modern racial terms. In the end, perhaps the question is not what race they were, but why we're still asking. The past is not just bones and temples. It's a battleground of ideas. And Egypt, golden and eternal, still stands at the center. If this episode challenged what you thought you knew, leave a comment below. What do you think about the identity of the ancient Egyptians? Don't forget to subscribe to Whispers of the Past, where lost truths rise again.